winning 90% of your new business because you have some sort of incredible value.
I'm going to take a bit of a different angle.
I've got a budget this big. I'm going to give it to you because you have a really killer plan.
You give a Red Bull to a turtle, what do you expect?
I think that's a dead turtle. So let's move on to...
Hebrew.
Cheers.
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 Does your current premium finance company lock you into long-term agreements? That's because they don't want you talking to us. At IFS, we win your business the good old-fashioned way, with customer service. I know you don't always have to use a premium finance company, but when you do, you should use IFS. Cheers.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Digital Insurance Pint podcast. As always, I'm your host, Tom Reed, and I'm here joined by my colleagues, Adam Mitchell, CEO of Mitch Insurance.
Hello.
Jeff Roy, CEO of Excalibur Insurance.
Welcome, Pinters.
And Steve Earle, CEO of Cheap Insurance.
Good day.
And today we are very pleased to be joined by Ema Roloff. Ema is the co-founder of Roloff Consulting, and for today anyway is our token American on the show. So welcome, Ema.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. So Jeff's going to ask you a few questions to get to know you better, and you may have to put your north of the border hat on to answer a few of them. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeff.
Yeah, you can always do the American equivalent too. That's fine because your answers are worth 35% more than ours, right? With the exchange code. So I wanted to get my Wisconsin shirt out for you.
Ooh, look at that.
That your badge, your alumni, are you not?
Yes, I am.
That's great. And we're going to start off. We always start with a few questions just to get to know our guests. And Ema, I'm not sure you can pick a U.S. band, but we always ask our guests, who's your favorite Canadian band or artist?
Like maybe Celine Dion if we're going like favorite Canadian. In our house, we do a lot of listening, like from the American perspective. I mentioned to you guys, I've got a 7-year-old. So about all that's playing in our house right now is Taylor Swift on just repeat. And Kids Bop, which is the other repeat. So if you look at my Apple Music, those are the two things that sat at the top of it this year, whether they were me or her playing it, I'm not sure.
Awesome. If you could see one live concert, I'm pretty much sure I know what it is with your family or yourself. Who would you see and where would you see it?
See, I actually wouldn't go to Taylor Swift because, well, she wants, my 7-year-old would love that, but I don't think we're going to spend that much money on a concert for a 7-year-old. My husband and I used to go to see Dave Matthews Band every summer, and it's been a number of years. I think it's probably been about 10 years since we went. And he's still on tour. So I feel like if I could stars align, go back to one of those concerts again.
Oh, solid choice. Now, are you an iPhone or Droid user?
I'm an iPhone user.
And maybe share with our listeners, what are one or two apps you can't live without on your iPhone or anything new you've downloaded?
I would say the two that I probably use most frequently and couldn't live without would be just the Notes app. I do a lot of like idea dumps into that and like voice messages to myself in there. I track my goals in there, all that kind of stuff. And then probably the other would be TikTok because I do a lot of content creation there, but then also consuming both not great content for me to spend time watching and also stuff that helps me learn a lot. So I would say that that's probably the other major app on my phone.
Now, just share with your listeners, what are your favorite podcasts you like to listen to or any great books you're reading right now?
So recently, I just finished listening to 10X is Better Than 2X. And that was probably more of like a book study from my husband of like, you need to go and listen to this right now. And then the other is that I've been just started but haven't finished is AI in 2041 is the other one that I'm listening to right now.
Interesting. I'll check that out. The 10X one, I'm listening to that in Audible right now. So it's great listen. And last question, if you can go on a trip with your family anywhere in 2024, where would you go?
We've made the promise that we're going to do Disneyland. But the trip for my husband and I, we were actually just talking about, I'll be making my way back up to you guys and going to Banff, because the last time I was in Alberta, I didn't actually make it to Banff. So I'm excited to do that trip and probably do it a little bit more right by actually taking some time to be there and explore a little bit more.
Well, thanks, Emma. Great speed run.
Okay, Emma. So I guess for the listeners' benefit and mine as well, what's your career background? Can you sort of walk us through your journey?
Yeah, it's a bit of a windy road. So I actually started at UW-Madison studying education. So I have a secondary education degree. So in the States, that is 6th grade through 12th grade. And it was focused on social studies. So I initially wanted to be a psychology and sociology teacher in high school. And I loved teaching. I loved the opportunity to work with kids, but there's a whole lot that comes with teaching that's not just being in the classroom. And behavioral issues and parents and having to teach the textbook just wasn't quite the right fit for me. So I took a step away from classroom teaching and moved into a corporate training position. And I worked for a fast food chain here in the States that has about 600-700 restaurants. And my job was helping franchisees learn everything about owning one of those restaurants, from how to make a burger and use the fryers to how to run the business from an HR perspective, make sure that their inventory was accounted for appropriately, which was a really nice segue for me to realize, like, oh, I kind of like business. This is interesting to me. And I like the move away from the public sector and being in the classroom. And after a couple of years of that, being in the restaurant business is weird hours and long hours. And I recognized that that wasn't where I wanted to build my career. And so I started looking for new jobs. And truthfully, when I say I 100% fell into both insurance and technology, I mean that as sincerely as possible. I was looking for a new job, and my husband at the time was leading sales for a web development company and had just finished a project with my old employer, Navient. And he knew that I was looking for a job. He's like, why don't you apply for a sales job there? I think you'd be really good at sales. And I don't really fully understand what they do, but everybody that worked at the company that I worked with was really great. Like, you should try checking it out. I applied to my first sales role, my first technology role, and the only thing that I met the qualifications for was a 4-year degree. But I got really lucky that the COO at the time had worked with a ton of teachers when she was selling at IBM, because IBM used to go recruit teachers to come teach people about technology. And so I was given an opportunity that probably not a lot of people were, where they said to me, let's try it out for a year. Learn about our products, learn about sales, see if this is the right fit for you. We like you. And if this isn't the right fit, we'll find a different spot in the company. Thankfully, it worked out. I really loved sales. I loved the technology, and I got the bug for both. And it was while I was in that role, probably about a year, they came to me and they said, we need somebody to focus on the P&C insurance industry. We don't have anybody that's a subject matter expert there. Is that something that you want to learn about? After you've been given the opportunity to do what they did for me, you don't say no when they ask you if you want to learn about a new industry. And so truthfully, a little begrudgingly, I was like, okay, sweet. I'm going to go learn about the fascinating subject of insurance. And over the course of the next couple of years, fully found out exactly why there are so many people that are invested in this industry, and started building a lot of really great relationships. And I think now I'm stuck for good. I sold for that company for about 8 years and did a small stint at a core insurance platform provider on the carrier side. And it was just a big shift for me, going from a small company to a large company. And I either knew I was going to like that shift or I wasn't. And ultimately, it ended up not being the right fit for me. But my husband had since started a consulting company. So I joined him about 4 months ago. And our main focus is helping companies across the entire insurance lifecycle, whether that's the broker and the agent, insurtechs, and even some conversations on the carrier side about how do we educate to sell and change the way that we're selling so that we're selling the way people want to actually buy.
Cool. Great background. So you were in Calgary, as you said before, and you were the keynote at Amplify. How did you get hooked up with Sharif and Trufla? And then tell us too, from your experience coming to Canada and talking and what you heard and what you learned, what are some of the bigger problems or differences that you see the Canadian marketplace versus the US?
Yeah, so I actually just got connected to Sharif over LinkedIn, and I couldn't even tell you the origin of how or when or why we got connected. But we had just kind of been interacting with one another via like LinkedIn posts for some time. And then when they were planning the content for the conference last year, they reached out to see if I'd like to join them. So that was a nice little unexpected treat to get to come up and visit. I would say, and we were talking about this before we hit play, I wouldn't say I'm definitely like an expert in the Canadian market by any stretch of the imagination, because most of my career has been here in the US. But from the conversations that I had with everybody, it sounds like a lot of the challenges are parallel to what we see in the US market with our agents and brokers here. I would say where maybe there is a difference or a nuance was that some of the conversations that I was having in terms of like challenges or problems seem to be a bit more focused, like from the technology side, on like the challenges that are associated with some of the major players that are in Canada, just because there's more options in the US, that those frustrations or challenges from a technology perspective are more varied in terms of the names that we're using and the vendors that are coming up in those conversations. But, from a topic perspective, I talked about digital literacy, which educating people about emerging technology is important regardless of which side of the border you're on. I heard a lot of conversations about personalization and like how to use technology to help change the way that we're going about distribution, which is a really, really common conversation in the States. Margot Giles was there talking about like the journey of buying technology as an agent or broker and what that looks like in the learning curve that's associated with that. And we see that here in the US as well. So a lot of the conversations were very, very similar with just, I would say, like maybe some different terms or some nuances associated with kind of hitting on the specifics of the Canadian market.
Cool. So, Emma, you mentioned digital literacy, which I think is kind of an interesting term. So I got a couple of questions for you. I'm going to ask them in two parts here, and maybe you can channel your former teaching background for some of these questions. But can you explain what do you mean by digital literacy, and why is that important for businesses?
Yeah. So when I use the term digital literacy, what I'm talking about is a foundational understanding of how technology is going to shift the way that we work. And so it's this basic knowledge of the terms and the concepts that are talked about in the world of technology. So things like, what is artificial intelligence? What are the types of questions I should be asking if I'm looking at a cloud hosted solution? Kind of filling what I call the like chasm of education between technology providers and technology buyers. How are we making sure that as buyers, we have a solid understanding of the language and the ideas that people are selling to us on the technology side? And that foundational knowledge doesn't mean that you're learning how to write code. It doesn't mean that you are becoming the technical expert that's going in and actually building out a solution. It's understanding how these tools could impact your business and how to recognize opportunities of when and where to leverage technology to kind of take you to the next level.
So if you think about an organization that is about to go through a digital transformation, and you had to give some advice to the CEO of that organization, what kind of advice would that be? And as sort of a second part of that question, when we talk about digital transformations, is that really just about the technology, or is there more to it?
No. Well, and you actually set me up perfectly for my response, because I would say the number one advice that I would give to any CEO going up against a digital transformation is to start with people and process, and use the insights that you're gaining from your people and the way that you are approaching your business processes to inform a really strong vision. And that vision ultimately is the most important part of a transformation to me. And kind of goes back to that idea of digital literacy. You have to understand how technology can come in. You have to understand the potential options of what that future could look like, leveraging technology to be able to set that vision. But without that vision, you're not going to have enough forward-facing ideas supported across your entire company to implement technology in a meaningful way. And so like that vision is ultimately going to be what gets all of your people on your team invested in a change and ready to adopt it. That vision is going to be partially what dictates which tools and which partners or vendors are coming into your organization to help make it a reality. That vision is going to be what helps you think through what the future of your company could look like from a process perspective, to start engineering what that future looks like before you put technology to it. And so from my perspective, digital transformation is actually more about people and process than it is technology. Technology is just the enabler of your people and these new business processes that we're able to build using technology. And if you look at it that way, and you look at technology as the enabler as opposed to the thing that's coming out up front, you're going to be able to ultimately reach your goals sooner, even if it feels like you're getting out of the starting blocks a little bit slower on the front end, because that vision is going to be able to pull your team and the technology that you're implementing through to the finish line much more effectively than if you say, here's our new technology solution, figure out how to make it work. And so I like that. To me, starting with technology is never a winning approach.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think that, as a former technology person who shifted to the business side, right, that vision is so important, because going through any transformation, whether it's a digital transformation or something else, always sucks. It's always hard. It's always expensive. There's always people who don't want it, who don't want to change. But that if that vision that you put out there resonates with enough of the team, then they're going to do whatever is necessary to get there, right? Because they want that better thing, whatever that is, and they'll crawl over that broken glass of implementing some stupid technology to get there.
But they've got to understand why it makes sense for them. And that's, I guess, another thing that I didn't dive too deep into there. But your vision can't just be, we're going to be a technology-driven company. The vision has to be specific enough so that every leader in the company can take it to their individual department and to their team and help every single person on that team understand what's in it for them, or they don't give a flying. I don't know if swearing is a thing on this podcast.
Yeah, swearing is required. So just for the record,
well, then if you can't get them to understand what's in it for them, they're not going to give a flying fuck about why you want to implement the technology. And that's the piece that I think a lot of people assume, like, well, they work for us, they're going to do what we say. But you can waste. I've literally seen companies waste companies I've worked with waste hundreds of thousands of dollars because they just didn't take the time to focus on that people part on the front. And it was easier for them to pull the plug and waste the money than to try and do it the right way. Talk about like a evangelizing moment. Seeing that happen firsthand early in my career was like, you've spent how much money and you're just going to walk away from the project because you can't figure out the change management side? Like, let's take a month and talk with your team and figure out, and like, no, the executives don't want to worry about that change side. So we're just going to keep it the way it is. When you see those kinds of things happen firsthand, you really start to recognize like, no, like the people in the business are the one doing the work. The people that have to adopt these technologies are ultimately the ones that have the power, even if they're not making the buying decision. So you better get that part right.
In your digital literacy, I heard you mention AI. What are key technologies in digital literacy 101 that we should be looking at and embracing in our organizations right now?
So AI, I think, is one term that everybody needs to get a very good handle on, and not just artificial intelligence at its like base level, but the fact that artificial intelligence is actually a group of technologies, and it's an umbrella term that includes things like computer vision, speech technology, natural language processing. There is a whole bucket of different features and capabilities of artificial intelligence that kind of flow up to that umbrella term. So I think it's really good for consumers to recognize what is capable with AI, but then also what do those different terms mean? Because I think that those terms are used to confuse buyers. As somebody walking around on a showroom floor, it's not uncommon to hear somebody or see somebody's advertisement say, like, we've got AI and ML. Well, that's like saying I have flowers and roses for sale. Roses are a more specific type of flower, just the same way machine learning is just a more specific type of AI. But if you don't know, it sounds fancier. So understanding those nuances of what bubbles up into that larger category and how each one of those tools functions at a high level, I think is a really great starting point from the AI perspective. I also think there are levels to things like cloud hosted solutions. That there is software as a service, there's platforms as a service, there's infrastructure as a service. There are different levels of how you can shape cloud computing and how, as a consumer, you interact with that. And there's not a right or a wrong, but when you're making buying decisions, I've seen a lot of technology vendors just say, we've got a cloud solution. And then there's nuances to that are unveiled as you move along, rather than having a strong understanding of exactly what that looks like on the front end. So I would say getting a good handle on the cloud computing side of things and what that means, and understanding the types of questions you should ask there is another really important foundational item for people that are buying software. And then the third one is probably, I talk about this as one of my top three. It's slightly less universal, but specifically within the insurance industry, IoT, the Internet of Things, but more specifically, the data that's starting to come out of the Internet of Things, which is now kind of being shaped as like the Internet of Behavior, and the insights that we're able to pull from that data. That's another really important place for people to start building a better understanding of what types of data sources do we now have available to us? How are predictive analytics going to shape how I do my job, or how our industry views things like risk moving forward? I think that's going to have a really big impact on the insurance industry as we move forward. And it might not be by March of 2023 or 2024 that we're hearing that conversation pop up all over the place. But over the next couple of years, we're going to see that predictive analytics piece and all of those connected devices and their data taking a much more like center stage for us in the insurance industry and beyond.
Okay, I want to try and bring it back to the workplace. If that was, a well-rounded answer about sort of the depth of the different technologies, and let's sort of take for granted that you know what you're talking about for a second. How can you sort of dumb down the vision of how you think those technologies will integrate to our insurance workplace of the future? And where do you think the leaders of the industry need to be looking and thinking to help get us there?
So I think predictive analytics is very closely tied to AI. And I think where we're going to start to see, and these AI solutions now are often being presented as SaaS solutions to the marketplace. I would say where I see this coming into the insurance space, whether it's on the carrier side or the broker side, is core platforms that have a data structure that supports the use of predictive analytics and AI for driving decision making. And where that's going to change how the humans are interacting with things, rather than having to do the manual legwork of trying to figure out where to place a risk, or trying to do the manual legwork of, like, Jeff, you just brought up the idea of like running reports because your data is difficult to interact with. We're going to start to see a new generation, and it might be updated generations of platforms, but a new generation of software that's coming out that has a data structure that allows for these tools to be leveraged in a way that lets the people in the business focus on the people side of work and the things that are uniquely human, and lets all of these manual processes that we've been required to complete take care of themselves. So rather than a step taking 15 clicks, maybe it takes 2, because the AI and the predictive analytics and the things going on in the background as a part of these solutions, you click once and it does the manual work that you used to have to click 15 times for, and then it presents you with a decision point. So rather than doing all of the tasks and the steps yourselves, the platforms will present you with decisions to make as a human, and you can use your critical reasoning to make those decisions, and then be able to have extra time for things like thinking about how to grow the business, thinking about how to provide that personal touch to your clients, or, being creative and thinking of new markets to go after. Name whatever that like actual human interaction is that you're going to have. I think removing finally many of those manual steps is going to be that next evolution of when we've got these tools integrated with our core solutions that we're using.
I'd like to get a little controversial, if we could. You've done speaking, and you had a LinkedIn leading change events, a thing on LinkedIn where you looked at emerging trends and so on. I sort of have this feeling myself that our industry, distribution, I feel like we're always chasing these shiny things because we can't get stuff to work the way we want to. And we become victim of these awesome sales pitches. And then our tech stack just gets wider and wider and wider but we just can't get the job done. I think my question is more like, what do you see now? Have we been failed by suppliers in the past? And are they going to start to help us anytime soon?
So I think this goes back to a little bit of the conversation that we just had about the idea of people and process being the more important part. I think the way that I talk about this is that there was digital transformation 1.0 that's been taking place for the last 10 to 20 years, depending on whose clock you're running on. And that was the first wave of digitizing processes and bringing technology into companies at a wider scale. So much of that was driven by the technology itself and the idea that you're going to be left behind if you do not adopt this technology. Now, realistically, yes, there are still manual processes. Yes, there are people that are still using paper, whatever. But by and large, everybody has made at least a little bit of that initial crest into the world of technology. But now we need to look back at the lesson that we learned during that digital transformation, first phase. And as we head into this next phase, we need to be honest with ourselves and recognize, again, that the technology is an enabler and that it's not going to solve all your problems by itself. And any vendor that's going to come in and tell you that their technology and their technology alone is going to be what solves the problems that you're having, they're lying to you and they are misleading you. Because any vendor that wants to be successful with an implementation is going to talk to you about things like change management. They're going to talk to you about how and where your analyzing gaps within your current process to what you want to be doing in the future. They're going to help you maybe map out what that process of the future looks like. They're going to be talking with you about preparedness and the things that you need to do on your end before we bring in the technology to make sure that you're successful. And that conversation is going to look a little different, or it should look a little different based on the lessons that we've learned. I would say I have gotten looks in the past, having been a technology vendor, for saying those things. And I've been on stage talking on a panel where I've actually, then walked off and had a conversation with a colleague of mine where they've told me, well, like, sometimes you can't be fully transparent with a client because, they don't know what they don't know. And, there's a lot of layers from the technology sales side of people that just want to make the promises of what the technology is capable of. But but the realistic thing is you're never going to hit those ROIs, and you're never going to hit that potential if you don't pay attention to those other things on the back end. And so I would say my hope for the industry would be that we are maturing in the way that we make purchase decisions and maturing in the way that we sell so that we can actually figure this out. Because, I was talking with somebody today, and he was telling me he sat on the board of an insurance carrier. And he was like, they mentioned during a meeting that there were over 200 applications. And just the idea that there would be 200 applications in one company is mind-boggling to me. And I kind of laughed, and I'm like, that's actually probably on the low end for a large carrier. And that spread that you're talking about comes from that shiny object syndrome and people chasing one part of their problem and trying to bring something in that fixes that problem. But ultimately, it just exacerbates the problem and moves the bottleneck to a different spot, or causes something else to go off kilter so that you still have essentially the same root problems. And we need to take a step back and look at things holistically of where we have opportunity and figure out how all of those pieces fit together for us to ever reach that potential that we've all been talking about. The fact that 70% depending on the statistic that you look at, 70 to 80% of digital transformations still fail. That makes me want to throw up, because that means that nobody has paid attention to the lessons that we should have been listening for the last decade. And there is a different approach, and there's an approach that we know that works, but it comes down to the customer being their own advocate and kind of pushing solution providers to help them work through all of these other dynamics that are arguably more important than the technology itself.
It's funny that these things that you've just talked about are things that have been talked about forever, like in the technology world. Like, I worked a long time ago at a large technology firm called EDS, headquartered down in Plano, big American, global firm actually. And, even back in, the 90s, they were talking about, what is the business outcomes you're looking for? They actually had a really good process for engaging with their clients and engaging with the business outcomes you're looking for, whatever. But it's still super rare, and so it actually irritates me that we're still having these same conversations, 30, 40 years later. And it's still just technology. I don't care whether it's COBOL or whether it's XML. It's still just technology. And the point is to get the business outcomes you're looking for, not to build the shiniest tech stack that you've ever seen. So that leads me to a question. You talked about selling differently. You also talked about buying differently, but specifically about selling differently. So what do you do at Roloff Consulting? In its still in its infancy here, but what do you do to help salespeople sell differently?
Yeah. So I'm going to take a half step back and touch on the idea of buying differently first, because that's the catalyst for why we have the approach that we do towards sales. So this started before COVID, but certainly during COVID, buying behavior at scale completely changed. People no longer, I don't think anybody really enjoyed ever being sold to. I don't think there was ever a time in history where people were like, oh yeah, come sell me a vacuum at my front door. But the mentality that you you needed a salesperson to be able to gather the information that was needed to make a buying decision has fundamentally shifted by the internet coming in and information access being so readily available. And when you look at statistics, again, since I've been selling over the last 10 years, there's been the conversation of how much research happens before somebody actually talks to a salesperson. And there's, again, varying statistics, but it's something like 60 to 70% of the buying cycle is completed before somebody ever wants to talk to a salesperson. And so when you start looking at that fundamental shift, you recognize how much people are relying on online research and access to information to drive their buying decisions. And you start to realize that if you can get to the front end of that and you can insert yourself into their research and the learning that they're doing about your industry or how to solve their problem, the more likely you are to be the person that they choose on the back end when they're ready to interact with a salesperson. So some of the statistics, again, kind of pulling through. So yeah, maybe I'm doing 60 to 70% of my research and like education online. But then there's also 60% of the time, people have made a decision on who's going to be their final few selection in their buying criteria before they've ever talked to anybody. So if you've lost out before they've even started talking to vendors because you didn't show up as a part of their research process. And then if you look at who they actually choose to work with, it's over 70% of the time that buyers will choose to work with the vendor that helped them turn their vision into a reality. And that process of turning a vision into a reality starts before they ever pick up the phone to talk to you or fill out a form online. So again, if you can shift your activity from trying to interrupt somebody's day-to-day or show up at just the right time when they're trying to make a buying decision, and you shift your energy towards being the person that helps educate them in the first place, you're building authority as a leader in that space. You're building trust with your buyer that you can help solve their problem. And you're helping them take that vision that they have in their mind and turn it into a reality. And the likelihood that that business comes to you is significantly higher on the back end. At the very least, you're a part of the discussion when they're making a buying decision because you were involved earlier in that process. So our approach to sales is really education focused and looking at how we can use digital tools like social media, webinars, your website, direct call to actions, things like a newsletter that are more like transactional ways to get people engaged with your brand. How are you using those tools to educate your buyer so that when the time comes, they trust you to solve the problem?
Awesome. I think I see Jeff, Adam, and Steve all taking notes at the moment.
That's good. They call it, I know Salesforce called account-based marketing, different things like that. And, I know we're busy at Excalibur trying to make sure, hey, we show up and we rank well. We have, Adam does a lot of stuff on his website too about probably more personal lines focus for both of us. But, basically I agree 60, 70% of the research happens before anybody ever calls you or do anything, right? So, that's where it's important. And, if your website has a bunch of people in the front of it that don't look like your staff and it loads like a bag of hammers and you have no content, your chance of being successful in the future is very low, right? That seems to be table stakes, but so a lot of people have not figured this out.
Well, in social media specifically too, moving beyond just your website as an organization is a pretty important part of this because the way that we're searching over the last couple of years has pretty drastically changed and will drastically change based off of generative AI coming into play. And so when you look at things like Google search and SEO and being able to rank on a website perspective, that could change once Bard is more advanced and suddenly Google doesn't have the incentive to rank people based off of their content. They have an incentive to answer via their generative AI when someone asks a question. So they might be scraping data from your website and you might still be ranking okay, but somebody's going to have to scroll all the way down the page to find you from that perspective. And tools like TikTok or YouTube Shorts or just a YouTube channel in general things like this podcast. These are ways for you to stand out and also get access to people that are searching differently. So younger generations like millennials like myself or people younger than me, their searching behavior is actually opting towards Instagram and TikTok more than it is Google. And I can tell you there's certain things that I would prefer to search on TikTok because I know I'll get a video that will show me step by step what I need to do. Or it will give me a video that makes me feel like it's more legitimate than whatever somebody paid for showing up on the front page of Google with. And so that is even deeper instilled into these people that were, in college and high school and coming of age now. During COVID, when all of this like short form video hit the scene, it changed the way that they search and it changed the way that people build trust with them. And so it's going to become more and more important, especially on something like personal lines, to be able to show up wherever those buyers are doing their research, even if it's not in a traditional mechanism like we've thought of in the last number of years.
I got one last question here, I guess, and there's probably 35 other questions we have, but tell us about Iris. A lot of us met Margot in Calgary, and I saw a couple other times. I'm just blown away by, I saw her ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Did a bunch of videos. I think you might have been part of that.
I was the one behind the camera during those.
Yeah, I thought so. I figured you might have something to do with it, but she's built a kick-ass team of amazing women running this company, changing the BMS AMS landscape. Just tell our users about the company and kind of your role there, because in Canada she hasn't not come to Canada yet. Not sure what her plans are, but it is pretty inspirational what she's doing down there to change the game. So maybe to share with our listeners what's going on.
Yeah, so Margot and her co-founder Lindsay Strong both come from the broker agency side, and they were working in distribution for years and years with all of the same players that we know and potentially don't love. And the origin story really starts from when Margot was the COO over the top of her agencies and was fed up with not being able to accomplish the things that she wanted to from a technology standpoint. And so at that point, she stepped away from one of the large software vendors in the States here, the AMS, BMS market, and started to build out her own platform. And at the time, it was leveraging Salesforce and trying to kind of take, again, another framework or another tool set that wasn't designed with insurance in mind and try to retrofit it to meet the needs of an agency. And there were multiple iterations. I think if I'm thinking through the story correctly, there were probably 5 versions before they got to the point where they are today, having built out a platform from the ground up that's, again, comes from that people side and that process side and actually acutely understanding what it's like to work in those systems day in and day out. So rather having come into the insurance landscape with a technology mindset, like a lot of insurtech companies do, of like, well, we know our technology will solve this problem. She's spent time on the business, and Lindsay, same thing, spent time in the business, recognizing the problems that were there and trying to come up with a different approach. And I know we don't have a ton of time, but I would say some of the main kind of differences from platform perspective with Iris are things like the way that the data is managed within Iris. One, going back to what you said earlier, Jeff, you're not going to have to pay to get access to your data, which I think is a fundamental shift. It's your data. It's your data that's within the platform, but it's looking at a human-centric approach to the way that data is managed. So I always think of Dr. Seuss when I say this, but like a person is a person is a person, no matter how small, is like the add-on from Dr. Seuss that I always want to come to when I hear Margot say that. But the system is set up so that the data looks at a human as its own entity, and that human has relationships with other humans and organizations or entities within the system, rather than the entity having people associated with it and that person potentially being duplicated in multiple spaces across the platform. And when you've got a different approach to the data structure in that way that's human-centric, it allows you to do things like what we were talking about before and tap into that data differently to recognize opportunities for cross-sells or upsells and be able to see where that human has relationships with other humans or other entities. So Margot always uses herself as the example. Maybe you have her on a policy as a driver, and that's what she is in your system. But Margot as a person is associated with all of her agencies, Iris as a company. She maybe has multiple vehicles that she's driving. She's got a home. There's so much more to her as a person and as a agent or broker, so much more to potential to that relationship than her being a buyer or being a driver on a vehicle. And so when you start to look at shaping the data differently, it unlocks this whole new avenue of how you can use the AMS or the BMS to really recognize opportunity and grow your business without having to rely on some of the same kind of like traditional approaches to like mass marketing and those types of things that we were talking about are shifting pretty drastically right now. And so there is like with some of those opportunity recognition pieces, like, or being able to figure out where to place a risk, they're starting to, they've brought in generative AI into the platform to start help making some of those decisions as well. And so those are probably some of the big shifts in terms of the mentality associated with Iris as a platform versus what we see in the marketplace today.
When's this thing game ready? Like, is it in market?
We have our first like handful of what we would call like evangelists in the platform right now, giving us some feedback. And right now the target date is March to start moving people into production.
Sounds like what Iris is doing is going to help change the game, open things up.
And one thing that I would add, going back to maybe one of the questions that you asked earlier, Steve, was this idea of like, how do we make sure that we're not like victim to a shiny object? Because again, I just used some of the very shiniest terms that exist, like a different data structure and AI. But where I would say is there's a different approach here is the thought process of like asking some of the hard questions of how do we implement a solution in a way that's meaningful? So does taking the filing cabinet of data that was handed to you and shaken up and remapping it into a system when that data is inherently dirty, for lack of a better term, and putting it into a new system, is that the right decision? Is there a way for us to normalize that data? What are the things that are associated with your team having been, again, maybe operating in a platform that has a UI that's 15 years old? Like, what does it mean for them to get a new solution with a different UI? And what do we have to do to train them? There's a lot more than just the platform itself that comes into play here. And part of the reason that I feel really confident, like aligning myself with Lindsay and Margot, is they both live that life. And so early on, working with them, hearing them talk with potential customers and some of those like early evangelist companies that we're working with, hearing those types of conversations makes me very optimistic that we're paying attention to the right things as we're moving through implementing these new tools. And it's that piece of the approach that I ultimately think is going to be a big differentiator as well.
It's pretty amazing. We're too busy dealing with dirty data done dirt cheap with right now. So we need some cleaner data going on, right? So
okay, all right, Emma, thanks very much, and really appreciate you participating in this exercise with us. And I also want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, IFS Premium Finance. So Emma, we don't always give our guests the opportunity to speak freely, but you've been a great sport, so we're gonna do you the solid of letting you speak freely. So why don't you take a minute or two, whatever you need, and just give us your thoughts in the future. Give us the unvarnished, honest to goodness truth, in the Ema Roloff style here to close off the episode.
All right. Feels like a little bit of pressure, but I would say the end of the day, I know a lot of our conversation was focused on technology and where technology could potentially take the industry. But I think the insurance industry at its core is inherently about people and relationships. and making a promise to our policyholders that we're going to be there during their toughest times. And, I talked about people and process being the focus, but also kind of taking a step back and looking at how do we simplify the way that we do our work so that we can focus again as humans on that innately human part of what our business is what all of this is about. So when you're looking at implementing technology and bringing it into the company, think through how is it going to help you support that promise that you've made to your policyholders more efficiently, and how is it going to help you make your employees enjoy working with you. And if you keep those two things in mind, it's going to help us solve a lot of problems at an industry level and also help you implement technology in a way that's going to be much more helpful for you as an organization. So again, kind of coming back to that people-centric piece of it and always keeping your employees and customers in mind.
Is retention important to your brokerage? Of course it is. That's why at IFS, we have a cancellation prevention process. Want more details? Give us a call. I know you don't always use a premium finance company, but when you do, you should use IFS. Cheers.